Imagine you're looking at a map of Asia, except something is very wrong with it. Where there should be one enormous country stretching from the Pacific coast all the way to the mountains of Central Asia, there are instead a half-dozen smaller ones. A wealthy coastal republic hugging the southern shoreline, a separate industrial state clustered around the old northern capital, a vast, thinly populated interior going its own way, breakaway regions in the far west and the high plateaus, each with its own flag, its own currency, its own army. The largest nation in human history, by population, simply gone, replaced by a patchwork. Yeah, okay, that map doesn't exist. China is very much still one country, still one of the two most powerful states on the planet. But here's the thing that makes this question worth asking. China holding together isn't some law of nature. For huge stretches of its history, it wasn't one country at all. It fell apart, violently, over and over again. And every single time, against staggering odds, it pulled itself back together. So today, let's ask the question that historians and strategists have genuinely wrestled with. What would it actually take for China to break apart and stay broken? And if it did, what would the world look like on the other side? Let's start with the part everyone gets wrong, because you can't understand this scenario without it. People tend to think of China as ancient and permanent, like it's just always been this single unbroken thing for thousands of years. That's not really true. What's actually ancient and permanent is the idea of China. The reality on the ground has been much messier. There's a pattern historians talk about, sometimes called the dynastic cycle. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. A powerful dynasty unites the land. It rules for a while, sometimes brilliantly. Then it grows corrupt or overstretched or unlucky. Natural disasters pile up. Rebellions break out. And the whole thing collapses into a period of division and warlords and competing kingdoms. And then, crucially, someone conquers everyone else and puts it all back together, and the cycle starts again. This has happened again and again. After the fall of the Han Dynasty, China split into the three kingdoms, a period so dramatic they've been making stories and games about it for centuries. It fractured during the aptly named 16 Kingdoms era. It broke apart in what's called the Northern and Southern dynasties, even as recently as the early 20th century. After the last emperor was overthrown, China dissolved into the warlord era, where different generals carved out their own territories and fought each other for control. So the historical record is clear. China fragmenting is not the weird outcome. China fragmenting is almost the default outcome. The genuinely strange, remarkable thing, the thing that actually needs explaining, is why it always comes back together. So why does it? A few reasons, and they matter enormously for our scenario, because to break China permanently, you'd have to defeat every single one of them. First, there's the cultural glue. For over 2,000 years, China has had a shared written language that ties together people who literally cannot understand each other's spoken dialects. A merchant in the south and an official in the north might speak mutually unintelligible languages, but they could read the exact same characters and the same classic texts. That shared high culture created a powerful sense that, whatever the current politics, all of this was fundamentally one civilization that ought to be one state. Second, there's the machinery of the state itself. China invented a professional civil service, recruited by examination, more than 1,000 years before most of the world. That bureaucracy could survive the fall of individual dynasties and reassemble the state around whoever came out on top. And third, there's simple geography and economics. The great river valleys, the canals linking north and south, the interlocking agricultural regions all pushed toward integration. Splitting them apart tended to make everyone poorer, so there was constant pressure to reunify. Okay, so that's the fortress we have to bring down. Now, let's talk about how, in a plausible alternate scenario, it might actually come down and stay down. And I want to be careful here because this is speculation, not prediction. I'm not saying this will happen or is likely to happen. I'm asking what combination of factors it would take, historically and structurally, for the pattern to finally break. Think of it like a puzzle. What are the pieces? The first piece is almost always economic. Look back through history, and the moment a Chinese state starts to fracture is usually a moment when the central government can no longer deliver prosperity and stability, and the regions start to feel like they'd be better off managing their own affairs. In our imagined scenario, picture a severe, prolonged economic crisis. Not a bad year, but a genuine structural breakdown that drags on. The regions that generate the most wealth, historically the coastal south and east, start to resent sending their money inland to prop up poorer regions and a struggling center. That resentment is the crack in the foundation. It's happened before. It's the kind of pressure that has torn states apart throughout history, not just in China. The second piece is the weakening of the center's grip. A unified China depends on the central authority being able to appoint local officials, move military commanders around, so they never build a personal power base and keep any single region from becoming strong enough to defy the capital. Now imagine that grip slipping, maybe through a succession crisis at the top, a contested transfer of power with no clear winner. Maybe through the center becoming so consumed with its own internal struggles that it takes its eyes off the provinces. Historically, this is the exact moment regional strongmen start acting independently. They stop forwarding tax revenue. They start keeping their local troops loyal to themselves rather than the capital. On paper, they still belong to the country. In practice, they're building their own little states. This is almost word for word how the Tang dynasty, one of China's golden ages, slowly came apart and how the warlord era began. The third piece, and this is the one that makes it stick, is the peripheries. China proper, the historic Han heartland, is surrounded by enormous regions with distinct cultures and histories, places that were incorporated into the empire, but never fully became the same as the core. Think of the vast western deserts, the high plateaus to the southwest, the grasslands to the north. In every period of Chinese weakness, these regions have been the first to drift away because their connection to the center was always more about imperial power than shared identity. In our scenario, as the center weakens and the wealthy regions turn inward, these peripheral regions would likely make their own moves toward independence. And this time, with no strong center to eventually reconquer them, some of them might actually make it stick. So put the pieces together. A deep economic crisis cracks the foundation. A crippled central government loses its grip on the provinces. Regional power bases harden into de facto states. The peripheries break for the exits. And critically, for this to be permanent rather than just another turn of the dynastic cycle, no single successor manages to conquer all the others and reunify the whole. Maybe because outside powers have an interest in keeping China divided. Maybe because the successor states become strong and entrenched enough, fast enough, that reconquest becomes impossible. Maybe because in a modern world of hard borders and international recognition, a breakaway state that survives its first few years tends to just stay a state. That last point might be the most important difference from every previous era. In the past, fragmentation was a phase. In a modern international system, fragmentation can become a permanent fact on the ground. All right, let's say all of that happens. Let's flip the coin and say this time, the pattern finally breaks. What does the map actually look like? Now, any specific carving up of China is guesswork, so treat this as one plausible sketch, not a prophecy. But based on the real economic and cultural fault lines, here's roughly how it might shake out. The biggest winner would probably be the coastal south and east. This is the wealthiest, most globally connected, most economically dynamic part of the country, home to the great trading cities and manufacturing hubs. Freed from having to subsidize the rest, a southern coastal republic could plausibly become one of the richest and most trade-focused states in the world, essentially a giant version of the city-state economies that already dot that coastline. It would look outward, toward global commerce, rather than inward. The north, centered on the historic capital region, would be a different kind of state. This is the political and historical heartland, the seat of power for centuries. It would likely see itself as the true heir to the Chinese state, and it would probably be more focused on political power and military strength than on trade. You could imagine real tension between a wealthy commercial south and a proud, power-focused north, each claiming to be the real China. The vast interior and the peripheries are where it gets most uncertain. The western regions and the high plateaus, with their distinct cultures, would likely push for full independence and might achieve it, potentially with support from neighboring powers who'd be delighted to see a giant rival replaced by smaller, weaker states. The huge agricultural interior might fragment further or align with one of the larger successor states, and there would almost certainly be messy, contested zones, places claimed by more than one successor, where the borders stay violent and unsettled for a long time. Now here's where it gets genuinely world-changing, because a fragmented China wouldn't just be China's problem. It would reshape the entire planet, and not necessarily in the ways you'd expect. Let's walk through it. First, the global economy would go through an earthquake. A unified China is the workshop of the world. An enormous share of global manufacturing, of the supply chains behind basically everything you own, runs through it. A sudden fragmentation, with new borders, new currencies, and disrupted trade between the successor states, would send a shockwave through the world economy. In the short term, this would probably be painful for everyone, including you, wherever you're watching this. Prices would spike, shortages would hit, but over the longer term, it's more complicated. Some of that manufacturing might simply relocate to other countries, and the wealthy coastal successor state might actually keep humming along as a trading power, meaning the disruption could be less total than you'd fear, though still enormous. Second, and this is huge, there's Taiwan. The entire dangerous standoff over Taiwan exists because a powerful unified China claims it and has the strength to potentially back that claim with force. Remove the unified China from the picture, and that pressure largely evaporates. A collection of competing successor states, busy dealing with their own survival and rivalries, would be in no position to mount that kind of challenge. In this scenario, one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the world just quietly deflates. That alone would reshape the security picture of the entire Pacific. Third, the balance of global power would tilt dramatically. For years, the story of international politics has been framed as a contest between two superpowers. Take one of them off the board. Replace it with a cluster of medium-sized states that are as focused on each other as on the outside world, and the entire structure of global power reorganizes. Other regional powers, India, Japan, the states of Southeast Asia, and Russia, would suddenly find themselves in a completely transformed neighborhood, with new opportunities and new dangers. Some would benefit enormously. Others might find that a chaotic, unstable set of successor states on their border is far more dangerous than a single predictable rival ever was. Because that's the thing people often miss about this scenario. A weaker China is not automatically a safer world. Fragmentation means instability, refugee flows, contested nuclear weapons, and unpredictable new governments. And instability on that scale, in a region that's central to the world, could be terrifying for everyone. Which brings us back to that impossible map we started with, the half-dozen states where one giant used to be. It's a genuinely fascinating scenario to imagine, and looking at the actual history, it's not nearly as far-fetched as it first sounds. China has broken apart many times. The pattern is real, but so is the other pattern, the one that's held for 2,000 years, the deep, stubborn pull toward reunification, the shared culture and machinery and geography that has, every single time so far, put the pieces back together. Betting against that force is betting against one of the most consistent trends in all of human history. So would China ever actually split into pieces and stay that way? Probably not. The weight of history is against it, but probably is not the same as never. And the strangest part of this whole exercise is realizing that the country we treat as the most solid, permanent fixture on the map is, if you zoom out far enough, a civilization that has spent much of its existence in pieces and has simply been very, very good at pulling itself back together. Whether it always will be is one of those questions we won't know the answer to until, one way or another, history decides to show us.